My daughter-in-law called the cops to have me thrown out of her house, telling the 911 operator I was an aggressive trespasser. She thought she was putting me in my place, a final humiliating power move. She had no idea that the deed to her beautiful suburban castle was in my name, and that I was her secret landlord. She wasn't just calling the police on her mother-in-law, she was illegally harassing the property owner. She thought she was kicking me out. She was actually giving me the legal grounds to kick her out. Before I begin, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. My name is Genevieve Price, though my friends call me Jenny. For 40 years, I navigated the sharp-edged world of commercial real estate lending, retiring as a senior vice president from one of Charlotte's largest banks. I am a woman who understands the language of numbers, the solid, irrefutable truth of a property deed, and the vast, cavernous difference between ownership and aspiration. At 68, my life is now a quiet, ordered affair, lived out in a charming historic bungalow in Dilworth, a neighborhood of old trees and even older money. My life is built on a foundation of prudence, hard work, and a deep, abiding belief in the security of assets. This belief is the root of my greatest secret. 5 years ago, my son Marcus, a good man with a heart softer than his judgment, wanted to buy a house with his wife, Danielle. But the house they wanted, a sprawling new construction monolith in the aspirational suburb of Ballantyne, was far beyond their means. Danielle, a real estate agent herself, was obsessed with it. To her, it was not a home. It was a testament, a 5-bedroom, 4-bath declaration that she had arrived. She saw the house as a stage for the life she intended to perform. I love my son and I adore my grandson Leo. I wanted them to have a stable, beautiful home. But I have never trusted Danielle. I have seen the brittle insecurity behind her designer sunglasses, the dismissive curl of her lip when she looks at my old-fashioned ways. Her ambition is a hungry, grasping thing, and her character, I feared, was a shallow foundation upon which to build anything of lasting value. So, I made a decision born of love and tempered by a lifetime of risk assessment. I did not give them a down payment. That would have been a gift without leverage. Instead, I made an investment. Through my lawyer and lifelong friend, Lorraine Bishop, I created a discreet limited liability company, the Queen City Property Group. Under that anonymous corporate veil, I purchased the Ballantyne house outright with cash. The arrangement was a masterpiece of quiet control. Marcus and Danielle were told that a private investor, impressed by their potential, had agreed to act as their lender, offering them a unique rent-to-own opportunity with a very favorable mortgage rate. Every month, they dutifully paid a modest sum, a figure I knew was less than half the market rental value, to a P.O. box managed by Lorraine. They received official-looking statements from the Queen City Property Group. They believed with all their hearts that they were homeowners building equity, living the suburban dream. They were not. They were tenants. And I, Genevieve Price, the quiet, retired mother whom Danielle treated with a thinly veiled, condescending pity, was their silent, secret landlord. For 5 years, I have subsidized their lifestyle, my generosity a hidden scaffolding supporting the beautiful house of cards they called their life. I did it for my son. I did it for my grandson. I waited patiently, for the day Danielle might grow into the grace of her surroundings. I did not know that she would instead try to use the very home I provided as a weapon against me. Danielle's disrespect was not a sudden storm, but a slow, corrosive drizzle that had been eroding the landscape of our family for years. She was the queen of the backhanded compliment, the master of the passive-aggressive jab. Her home in Ballantyne was her castle, and whenever I crossed its threshold, I was made to feel less like a beloved grandmother and more like a visiting peasant who had tracked mud on the royal carpets. A prime example of her particular brand of cruelty occurred last Easter. I had invited them all to my home in Dilworth for dinner, but Danielle had insisted, with a voice as sweet as poison, that it was just too much for me to handle. "No, Jenny, we insist on hosting," she'd said over the phone, her use of my first name a subtle but constant assertion of her status as my peer, not my junior. "You just come here and relax. Don't bring a thing." Of course, I couldn't show up empty-handed. I spent 2 days preparing my signature dishes, a slow-roasted leg of lamb with rosemary and garlic, and my famous sweet potato soufflé, a recipe passed down from my own grandmother. I also brought a gift for my grandson, Leo, a beautiful leather-bound collector's edition of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, a book I had loved as a child. I arrived at the Ballantyne house to find it in a state of performative perfection. Danielle, dressed in a crisp white linen dress that probably cost more than my monthly utility bills, greeted me at the door. "Oh, Jenny, you brought food," she said, her eyes flicking dismissively over the heavy casserole dishes in my hands. "You really shouldn't have. I have a caterer." She took the dishes from me and whisked them into the kitchen, where I later saw them relegated to a side counter, untouched, while the sleek, silver chafing dishes of the professional caterer took center stage on the granite island. The slights continued throughout the afternoon. When I gave Leo his gift, he was thrilled. He loved to read, a passion I had carefully nurtured in him. He hugged the book to his chest, his eyes shining. Danielle, however, was less impressed. "A book?" she said, a tinkling, false laugh in her voice. "How quaint. Leo, honey, why don't you go play with that new drone your other grandparents sent you? You can show Grandma Jenny later." She was not just dismissing my gift. She was actively redirecting her son's attention away from it, framing my thoughtful traditional present as boring and outdated compared to the expensive technology from her own parents. Later, as we sat down to eat the catered meal, which was beautiful to look at but lacked any real flavor or soul, she turned the conversation to my home. "Marcus and I were just saying," she announced to the table, "we really need to get a designer over to your little bungalow, Jenny. It has good bones, but it's so dark. A little paint and some new furniture could do wonders. Make it feel less like a museum." Marcus, my son, just sat there, swirling the wine in his glass, a pained but silent expression on his face. He never defended me. He never told her she was being rude. His conflict aversion, his desperate need for a peaceful life with this difficult woman, had rendered him a bystander to my slow, methodical humiliation. I smiled, a tight, polite smile I had perfected over the years. "I like my museum, Danielle," I said quietly. "It's full of things I love." She looked at me with a pitying expression, the look of a person who simply cannot comprehend a world not defined by newness, by status, by the constant, restless acquisition of things. In her eyes I was a relic, a sweet, harmless, but ultimately irrelevant old woman who didn't understand the modern world. She had no idea that this irrelevant old woman held the deed to her castle in a safe deposit box downtown. She had no idea that her landlord was sitting right there at her table, silently assessing the character of her tenant and finding it to be in deep, unsalvageable default. The final, irrevocable rupture did not begin with a grand betrayal. It began, as so many family wars do, with a small, seemingly insignificant skirmish over a child. It was a Saturday afternoon, a few weeks after the disastrous Easter dinner. I was at the Ballantyne house, a visit I made every weekend out of a sense of duty to see my grandson Leo. Marcus was out running errands. Danielle was upstairs in her home office, on a series of loud, important-sounding conference calls for her real estate business. Leo, who was 12, was sprawled on the family room sofa, his face illuminated by the flashing, violent lights of a video game on the massive television screen. His history textbook and a worksheet lay untouched on the coffee table beside him. I watched him for a few minutes, the sound of digital explosions filling the cavernous, high-ceilinged room. I knew he had a major history test on Monday. He had complained about it earlier. After he finished a particularly noisy level of his game, I decided to intervene, not as a disciplinarian, but as the grandmother who had always encouraged his academic pursuits. "Leo, honey," I said, my voice gentle. "That looks exciting, but don't you think you should take a little break and look at your history homework? That test on Monday is a big one." It was the kind of thing I had said to him 100 times before. It was the kind of thing grandmothers do. Leo sighed, the dramatic put-upon sigh of a 12-year-old boy. "In a minute, Grandma," he said, his eyes still glued to the screen. "I just want to finish this one last mission." "Why don't you finish the first mission of your homework instead?" I suggested, still smiling. "Then you can reward yourself with some game time. That's how I used to get through my dissertation." It was at that exact moment that Danielle descended the stairs. She had evidently finished her calls. She stood at the bottom of the staircase, her arms crossed, a thunderous expression on her face. She had clearly overheard our exchange. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet, each word a chip of ice. I was taken aback by her tone. I was just encouraging Leo to get started on his homework, I said, trying to keep my own voice light. He has a big test on Monday. Danielle walked slowly into the room, her eyes narrowed. She was not just angry, she was furious. It was a level of rage that was utterly disproportionate to the situation. I realized with a sudden chilling clarity that this was not about Leo's homework. This was about power. I am his mother, Genevieve, she said, her voice low and menacing. I decide when he does his homework. I decide his schedule. I decide what is important. And I will not have you coming into my house and undermining my authority with my own child. Danielle, that is not what I was doing, I said, standing my ground. I was simply being a grandmother. No, she hissed, stepping closer to me. You are being a critic. You are always criticizing. My decorating, my cooking, and now my parenting. You walk in here with your quiet, judgmental little smile and you act like you are the queen and this is your court. Well, let me make something perfectly crystal clear to you. This is my house. This is my family. And in my house I make the rules. The possessiveness in her voice was absolute. My house. My family. She had repeated the words like an incantation, a spell to ward off my influence. She saw my gentle reminder to my grandson not as an act of love, but as a territorial challenge, a threat to her dominion over the castle I had provided for her. I think you are overreacting, I said, my own voice now tinged with a cold, steely edge. And I would appreciate it if you did not speak to me in that tone. That was my mistake. My refusal to back down, my quiet assertion of my own dignity, was a spark on a leaking gas line. Her face, which had been a mask of controlled fury, twisted into something ugly and unrestrained. Oh, you would appreciate it, she sneered, her voice rising to a shrill, piercing pitch. You would appreciate it? You know what I would appreciate? I would appreciate it if you for once knew your place. You are a guest in this house. A guest. And right now, you are a guest who is no longer welcome. She was breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling. She looked at me with a hatred so pure and so profound it was shocking. The small, insignificant disagreement over homework had metastasized in a matter of moments into a full-blown declaration of war. And I had no idea how far she was willing to take it. In the ringing silence that followed her outburst, Danielle's eyes darted around the room as if searching for a weapon. Her gaze fell upon her smartphone lying on the kitchen counter. And in that moment, a new, terrible idea seemed to dawn on her. A way to escalate this conflict to a level from which there could be no return. It was a way to not just win the argument, but to utterly and completely humiliate me, to assert her dominance in the most dramatic and brutal way imaginable. With a look of cold, calculated purpose on her face, she turned and walked briskly out of the living room and into her office just off the foyer. I could hear her close the door. I stood there, my heart beginning to pound with a sense of dread, a feeling that something truly awful was about to happen. Leo had gone silent on the sofa, his video game forgotten, his eyes wide with fear. A moment later, I could hear the muffled sound of her voice through the closed door. It was a different voice than the one she had been using with me. It was high-pitched, frantic, and laced with a convincing, theatrical terror. And then I heard the words that would change everything. Yes, hello? I need the police. 911. Please, you have to send someone right away. My blood ran cold. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was actually doing it. Her voice rose in pitch, a masterclass in manufactured hysteria. My mother-in-law, she's here at my house and she's out of control. She's refusing to leave. She's being aggressive and she's scaring my son. I'm scared for our safety. The lies were so brazen, so monstrous, they took my breath away. Aggressive? Unstable? I was a 68-year-old woman standing silently in her living room. The only aggression in the house was emanating from behind her closed office door. Yes, the address is 1245 Kenilworth Drive in Ballantyne, she continued, her voice now punctuated by fake, gulping sobs. Please, just send someone to get her out of my house. I'm locked in my office. I don't know what she's going to do. I stood there, frozen, my mind unable to process the sheer, diabolical cruelty of her actions. This was not an act of anger. This was a tactic. It was a calculated, strategic move designed to inflict the maximum possible humiliation and to establish, in the most public and undeniable way, her absolute power over this domain. She was using the police as her personal eviction service, turning a family disagreement into a criminal matter. She was willing to risk my safety, my dignity, my very life, because a 911 call on a black person, any black person, is a potentially lethal gamble, all to win an argument over homework. Leo, who had heard everything, scrambled off the sofa. His face was pale, his eyes swimming with tears. "Grandma," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Why is she doing that? You didn't do anything." I knelt down and pulled him into a hug, my own body now shaking with a mixture of rage and a deep primal fear. "It's okay, baby," I whispered, my voice a poor imitation of the calm I wanted to project. "It's going to be okay. Your mother is she's very upset." But I knew it wasn't going to be okay. The sound of distant sirens began to cut through the quiet afternoon air, growing steadily closer. The red and blue lights would soon be flashing outside the windows of the house I owned. The authorities were coming to remove me as a trespasser from my own property. I made a split-second decision. I would not fight. I would not argue with the police. I knew how quickly a situation like this could escalate, how a black woman, even a well-dressed elderly one, trying to explain a complex property dispute to armed officers in the middle of a tense domestic call, could be perceived as belligerent, as a threat. My pride was not worth my life. I smoothed my dress, took a deep breath, and walked to the front door. I would meet them on the porch. I would not give Danielle the satisfaction of having me dragged out of her living room. I would walk out under my own power, a queen abdicating a throne that was already rotten to its core. The sirens grew louder, a screaming, wailing announcement of my daughter-in-law's victory, and my own profound and very public humiliation. The police cruiser pulled up to the curb with a quiet efficiency, its lights painting silent, strobing patterns of red and blue across the manicured lawns of the quiet suburban street. 2 officers got out. They were young, cautious, their hands resting near their hips. They saw me, a 68-year-old woman in a simple Sunday dress, standing calmly on the front porch, and their expressions were a mixture of confusion and professional wariness. "Ma'am," the taller officer asked, his voice polite but firm. "We received a call about a disturbance at this address." Before I could speak, the front door flew open. Danielle rushed out, her face a mask of tear-streaked, theatrical distress. She ran past me and directly to the officers, a damsel in distress seeking rescue from the dragon. "Oh, thank God you're here," she cried, her voice choked with fake sobs. "She won't leave. I've asked her repeatedly and she just refuses. She was getting so aggressive. I was afraid for my son." The officers looked from her hysterical performance to my quiet, still form. I could see the calculation in their eyes as they tried to make sense of the scene. "Ma'am, is this your residence?" the second officer asked me. This was the moment. The moment I could have detonated the entire situation. I could have said, "As a matter of fact, it is. I own this house. Here is the key. And this woman is my tenant." But I knew what that would sound like. It would sound like the ravings of a confused, unstable old woman, exactly as Danielle had painted me. It would escalate the conflict, create a scene, and put me in a position of arguing my case on my own front porch with 2 armed men who had been primed to see me as a threat. So I made the only choice I could. I chose dignity. I chose safety. I chose to lose the battle in order to win the war. "No, officer," I said, my voice calm and clear. "This is my son's home. I was just leaving." The officers visibly relaxed. The situation had been de-escalated. The unwanted individual was complying. "All right then," the taller officer said, nodding. "Why don't you go on and do that? We'll stay here until you've departed." It was a profound, soul-crushing humiliation. To be supervised by the police as I was escorted off my own property. I walked down the stone path to my car, every step a small, sharp agony. I did not look at Danielle, who was standing on the porch, wrapped in a blanket one of the officers had given her, the very picture of a traumatized victim. I did not look at my grandson Leo, whose small, pale face was pressed against the living room window, his eyes wide with a sorrow and a wisdom far beyond his years. I got into my old Buick, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb. I saw the police car in my rearview mirror, its lights now off, sitting in front of the house until I was safely out of sight. The entire neighborhood had witnessed my shame. The drive back to Dilworth was a blur of tears I refused to let fall. I was not just hurt. I was incandescent with a cold, hard rage unlike anything I had ever felt in my life. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a simple family argument. This was a calculated act of cruelty, a profound and unforgivable betrayal. I had just pulled into my own driveway when my phone rang. It was Marcus. He must have just gotten home. I let the phone ring, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I was not ready to speak to him. But he was persistent. He called again and again. Finally, with a deep, weary sigh, I answered. Mom. His voice was tight, strained. I just got home. The police were here. Danielle is a mess. What happened? What did you do? The question, the immediate, unthinking assumption of my guilt, was the final twisting turn of the knife. What did you do? What did I do, Marcus? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Danielle said you were yelling, that you wouldn't leave, that you were scaring Leo, he said, his words a recitation of the lies his wife had surely fed him. She said she had no choice but to call the police. Mom, why do you always have to provoke her? You know how she gets. Why can't you just back down? For the sake of peace. For the sake of peace. My son, my gentle, conflict-averse son, was asking me to accept the blame for my own humiliation, to swallow my own pain, to make myself small, all for the sake of keeping the peace with his volatile, cruel wife. He had heard her side of the story and he had accepted it without question. He had chosen his wife's lies over his mother's dignity. I have nothing to say to you right now, Marcus, I said, my voice as cold and empty as a winter tomb. You have made your position very clear. I hung up the phone before he could reply. I sat in my car in the quiet of my own driveway and the tears finally came. They were not tears of sadness. They were tears of rage, of grief, of a profound and absolute disillusionment. I had lost my son. Not to death, but to a weakness of character so profound it had allowed him to stand by and watch as his mother was treated like a criminal in her own home. The betrayal was now complete. And the consequences, I vowed in that moment, would be biblical. Marcus spent the rest of that Saturday evening and all of Sunday stewing in a toxic brew of self-righteous anger and marital obligation. He moved through his large, beautiful house like a thundercloud, his silence a heavy, oppressive blanket. He was angry at his mother for causing a scene, angry at the police for having been at his home, and angry at the disruption to his carefully maintained peace. Danielle, for her part, played the role of the traumatized victim to perfection. She was fragile, weepy, and clung to him, recounting her terrifying ordeal with me in breathless, exaggerated detail. Marcus, wanting only for the conflict to be over, soothed her, reassured her, and in doing so cemented his belief in her version of events. He was on his wife's side. He had chosen his team. He gave me the silent treatment. He did not call back after I hung up on him. He did not text. He was punishing me, waiting for the apology he felt he was owed. The truth, however, had a witness. And that witness was a 12-year-old boy with a conscience stronger than his father's. On Sunday evening, Marcus was in his home office trying to focus on some work, but his mind was still churning. He was replaying the scene in his head, the police cars, his mother's cold voice on the phone, his wife's tears. He was trying to build a solid case for his own anger to justify his position. The door to his office creaked open. It was Leo. His son stood in the doorway, his expression serious and troubled. He was holding his history textbook. "Dad," he said, his voice small. "Not now, Leo," Marcus snapped, his patience worn thin. "I'm busy. Go ask your mother." "I don't need help with my homework," Leo said, stepping into the room. "I need to talk to you about what happened yesterday with Grandma." Marcus sighed, rubbing his temples. "Leo, it's over. It was just a bad argument. Let's not talk about it." "No," Leo insisted, and there was a surprising firmness in his voice. He walked up to his father's desk and stood there, his small shoulders squared. "It's not over, because you think Grandma was wrong. And she wasn't." Marcus looked at his son, really looked at him for the first time all day. He saw the earnestness in his eyes, the deep, troubled sincerity. "What are you talking about, son? Grandma didn't do anything wrong," Leo said, his voice clear and unwavering. "We were in the living room. I was playing my game. She just asked me to do my homework. She was nice about it. She wasn't yelling." Marcus leaned forward, a flicker of uncertainty disturbing his anger. "Your mother said she was being aggressive." Leo shook his head, his expression one of profound, youthful disgust. "No, Dad. Mom was the one who was aggressive. She came downstairs and she was super mad. She started yelling at Grandma. She said Grandma was undermining her and that it was her house. The words, the simple, unvarnished truth coming from his own child, began to chip away at the foundation of Marcus's anger. And Grandma, she didn't yell back, Leo continued, his own eyes welling up with tears now. She just stood there. She told Mom not to talk to her like that. And that's when Mom got really mad. She went into her office and she called the police. And she lied, Dad. The word hung in the air between them. Lied? What do you mean she lied? Marcus asked, his voice a near whisper. I heard her on the phone, Leo said, his voice trembling now. She was pretending to cry. She told the police that Grandma was screaming and that she was scared. But Grandma was just standing there. She was quiet. Mom lied to you too when you came home. It wasn't like that at all. She was just being mean to Grandma like she always is. And it wasn't fair. The testimony was devastating. It was absolute. It was the simple, unshakable truth, delivered by the one person in the house with no agenda other than a child's innate sense of justice. In that moment, the entire narrative that Marcus had constructed, the narrative that had allowed him to blame his mother and placate his wife, crumbled into dust. He saw the scene now through his son's clear eyes. He saw his mother's quiet dignity. He saw his wife's calculated cruelty. And most damningly, he saw his own profound failure. He had not been a peacemaker. He had been a coward. He had been an accomplice. He had sided with the bully against the victim, and the victim was his own mother. A wave of shame so powerful it was physically nauseating washed over him. He looked at his son, at the tears of righteous anger on his young face, and he saw a moral courage that he himself had lacked. Thank you, Leo, Marcus said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. Thank you for telling me the truth. You are a good man. He stood up from his desk. He knew what he had to do. The silence he had been directing at his mother was a monument to his own foolishness. The apology he now had to make would be the most difficult and most important of his life. The drive from Ballantyne to Dilworth felt like a pilgrimage of shame. With every mile that passed, the weight of Marcus's failure pressed down on him, a physical presence in the passenger seat of his luxury sedan. The sleek, expensive car, usually a source of pride, now felt like a cage, a symbol of the shallow, materialistic world he had chosen over his own family's honor. Leo's words echoed in his head, a relentless, damning chorus. Mom lied to you, Dad. She was just being mean to Grandma like she always is. Like she always is. The phrase was a key, unlocking a vault of memories he had kept deliberately sealed for years. He saw, with a sudden, horrifying clarity, the long, slow pattern of Danielle's disrespect. The condescending remarks about his mother's home. The dismissive tone she used when talking about his mother's opinions. The subtle, constant campaign to isolate Jenny, to frame her as an out-of-touch relic. He had seen it all. He had heard it all. And he had done nothing. He had told himself it was just Danielle being Danielle. He had told himself it was the price of a peaceful home. He realized now that he hadn't purchased peace. He had merely purchased quiet at the cost of his mother's dignity and his own integrity. When he pulled up in front of the familiar, welcoming bungalow in Dilworth, the house he had grown up in, he felt a pang of homesickness so profound it was like a physical ache. This was a house of substance, of real, unconditional love. And he had betrayed its matriarch. He walked up the stone path and rang the doorbell, his heart hammering in his chest. When the door opened, his mother stood there, her expression calm, polite, and as distant as a winter moon. The familiar warmth in her eyes was gone, replaced by a cool, quiet watchfulness. It was the look of a woman who had been hurt too deeply to offer easy comfort. Marcus, she said, her voice neutral. She did not invite him in. Mom, he began, his own voice cracking. Can I please come in? I need to talk to you. She looked at him for a long moment, her gaze searching his face. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible nod, she stepped aside and allowed him to enter the home he suddenly felt he had no right to be in. He followed her into the living room, a space filled with the comfortable, familiar scent of old books and lemon polish. He stood awkwardly in the center of the room, while she remained standing by the fireplace, her posture erect, her arms crossed. She was not going to make this easy for him. And he knew he didn't deserve it to be. I am so sorry, Mom, he said, the words tumbling out in a raw, broken rush. I am so sorry. For everything. For what I said on the phone. For not being there. For all the times I wasn't there. She remained silent, her expression unchanging. I know what happened, he continued, his voice thick with shame. Leo told me. He told me the truth. That Danielle lied. That you didn't do anything wrong. And I believed her. I chose to believe her because it was easier. And that is a failure on my part that I don't know how I will ever forgive myself for. He finally looked up and met her eyes, his own swimming with tears. I have been a coward, Mom. I have let her disrespect you for years. I saw it and I ignored it because I didn't want to fight. I traded your honor for a quiet life. And there is no excuse for that. None. I am so ashamed. He sank onto the edge of the sofa, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with a deep, racking sob. He was not just apologizing for Saturday. He was apologizing for a decade of silent complicity. Genevieve watched him for a long moment. The icy wall around her heart began to thaw just a little. This was not a performance. This was real. This was the broken, remorseful son she had raised, finally emerging from the fog of his wife's influence. She walked over and sat down beside him, not touching him, but her presence a small, quiet offering of grace. I'm glad Leo told you the truth, she said softly. That boy has a good heart. He has his grandfather's moral compass. Marcus looked up, his face streaked with tears. What do I do, Mom? How do I fix this? You have already started, she said. By being here. By telling the truth to yourself. She took a deep breath. I forgive you, Marcus. I forgive you for your weakness. Because you are my son and I love you. He let out a shuddering breath of relief. The relief of a condemned man who has just been granted a pardon. But, she continued, and her voice now held a new steely resolve, you need to understand something. While I forgive you, I do not forgive her. What she did was not just a lie. It was an act of profound, calculated cruelty. She was willing to put my life in danger to win an argument. That is not something that can be fixed with an apology. That is something that must have consequences. Marcus nodded, his face grim. He knew she was right. I know, Mom, he said. Whatever you decide to do, I will support you. 100%. The peace in my house is not worth the price of my soul. Not anymore. He had finally chosen a side. He had chosen his mother. He had chosen his integrity. The apology was complete. And the path was now clear for the reckoning to begin. With Marcus's apology and his pledge of support, the emotional landscape had shifted. My personal grief had been acknowledged and my son was back in my corner. But the practical matter of Danielle's transgression remained. Forgiveness for Marcus did not mean amnesty for his wife. Her actions had been too egregious, the betrayal too profound. This was no longer a family squabble to be smoothed over. This was a strategic problem that required a strategic solution. The morning after Marcus's visit, I called my war council. It was a council of one, Lorraine Bishop. Lorraine had been my best friend since our days at Spelman College a lifetime ago. We had navigated life's triumphs and tragedies together. She was the godmother to Marcus and I to her daughter. But she was also one of the sharpest, most feared real estate attorneys in the state of North Carolina. She was a woman who did not suffer fools, and she had placed Danielle firmly in that category from the moment she met her. Lorraine was the one who had helped me structure the Queen City Property Group LLC, her legal genius providing the perfect discreet vehicle for my secret ownership of the Ballantyne house. She had called it my character insurance policy. I've been waiting for this call for 5 years, Jenny, she said, her voice a low, dangerous growl after I had recounted the entire sordid tale of the 911 call. I knew this day would come. That woman has the moral fiber of a wet paper bag. She crossed a line, Lorraine, I said, my voice quiet but firm. A line I didn't even know existed. A line. Lorraine snorted. Honey, she took a stick of dynamite and blew the whole damn bridge to smithereens. Calling the cops on you? In your own house. Does she have any idea of the danger she put you in? That's not just disrespect. That's a potential death sentence. Her righteous fury was a balm to my own still wounded spirit. I know, I said. And Marcus knows. He's on my side now. He's ready to support whatever I decide to do. Good, she said. It's about time he grew a spine. So what's the plan? Are we going with Operation Shock and Awe, where we just show up, change the locks and throw her Gucci bags on the lawn? Because I have to admit the visual is appealing. I smiled a small grim smile. As satisfying as that would be, no. We need to do this properly. We need to do it legally. We need to do it in a way that is clean, quiet, and utterly devastating. I don't want a messy public fight. I want a quiet, professional execution. I like the way you think, Lorraine said, her voice all business now. Okay, let's look at our assets. We have the LE. We have the deed. We have a de facto, if not formal, landlord-tenant relationship. They pay a monthly sum to the LLC in exchange for residency. That gives us leverage. She was quiet for a moment, the sound of her tapping on a keyboard coming through the phone. I could almost see her in her office, her sharp legal mind sifting through decades of real estate law. Her actions, Lorraine said, thinking aloud, could be legally defined as a breach of the terms of their tenancy. You can't just call the cops and file a false report on your landlord. That constitutes harassment. It creates a hostile living environment for the property owner, even if the owner isn't physically living there. It's a clear violation. So what does that mean legally? I asked. It means we have grounds, she said, a note of triumphant discovery in her voice. We don't need to go through a messy eviction court battle based on non-payment, because they have been paying. We can issue a notice based on a direct violation of the residency agreement. Specifically, a notice to cure or quit. Cure or quit. I repeated. Exactly, Lorraine said, her excitement growing. It's a formal legal notice that informs a tenant they have violated the terms of their lease. It gives them a choice. Either cure the violation, that is, fix the problem, or quit the premises, that is, move out. If they do neither, then you can proceed with a formal eviction. The beauty of the strategy began to dawn on me. It was elegant. It was surgical. And what, I asked, my heart beginning to beat a little faster, would be the cure in this situation? Lorraine laughed, a low, throaty, and deeply satisfied sound. Well, that's the beautiful part, isn't it? The person who committed the violation, the person who created the hostile environment, the person who harassed the property owner is Danielle. So the only way to cure the violation is to remove the source of the problem. The plan was now clear, shining with a cold, brilliant light. We would not evict the family. We would not punish my son or my grandson. We would surgically excise the cancer. So we send them a notice, I said, verbalizing the final step. And we tell them that Danielle has 30 days to permanently vacate the property. If she leaves, Marcus and Leo can stay. If she doesn't, they all go. That's the ball game, Lorraine confirmed. We put the choice and the entire future of her family's housing squarely in Marcus's hands. We force him to finally, formally, and legally choose between his mother's dignity and his wife's presence in that house. It's perfect, Jenny. It's absolutely, legally, poetically perfect. The War Council was adjourned. The strategy was set. The quiet, retired banker and her brilliant lawyer friend were about to draft a legal document that would be more explosive than any shouting match, more final than any family argument. The reckoning was coming. And it was going to be served on official letterhead. The days that followed my call with Lorraine were filled with a quiet, focused intensity. The war room was now Lorraine's stately law office in uptown Charlotte, a space of hushed carpets, antique law books, and the quiet hum of immense legal power. I spent 2 afternoons there not as a grieving mother but as a client, a CEO overseeing a critical acquisition, the acquisition of my own peace of mind. Lorraine approached the task of drafting the legal documents with the meticulous, almost joyful precision of a master craftsman. This was not just another legal filing for her. This was a righteous cause. She saw it as a chance to use the full weight and power of the law, a system so often used to protect the powerful, to defend a good woman from a petty tyrant. The key to this, Jenny, she explained as she sat at her large, polished desk, her computer screen filled with dense legal text, is to make it completely, utterly, and boringly professional. There can be no hint of emotion, no trace of personal animus. This document must read as if it were written by a faceless corporate entity dealing with a standard tenant violation. The cold, impersonal nature of it is what will make it so devastating. He was right. A screaming, emotional letter would be something Danielle could dismiss as a family drama. A formal legal notice from the Queen City Property Group LLC was an entirely different beast. It was a corporate action and it was unanswerable. The package she assembled was a work of art, a triptych of irrefutable truth. The first document was a simple, clean cover letter, printed on the LLC's official letterhead. It was addressed to the occupants of 1245 Kenilworth Drive. It stated in dry, formal language that a review of their tenancy had revealed a significant breach of their residency agreement and that the attached documents provided the details and the required legal remedy. The second document was the proof. Lorraine had the official certified copy of the property deed from Mecklenburg County, clearly showing the owner as Queen City Property Group, LLC. Alongside it, she included a certified copy of the LLC's Articles of Incorporation, the document filed with the North Carolina Secretary of State. And on that document, in the space for the company's sole proprietor and registered agent, was my name, Genevieve A. Price. There was no ambiguity. There was no room for argument. It was a matter of public record. The foundation of Danielle's entire world, her ownership of that house, was a legal fiction, and this document was the proof. The third and final document was the weapon itself, the formal notice to cure violation or quit premises. Lorraine had spent hours crafting the language of this notice, ensuring it was legally ironclad. It began by citing the specific, implied terms of their tenancy agreement, which included the right to quiet enjoyment and the prohibition of any acts of harassment, intimidation, or endangerment directed at the property owner or their representatives. Then came the description of the violation. It was described in the driest, most clinical terms imaginable. On the afternoon of Saturday, October 12th, the primary occupant, Ms. Danielle Price, did knowingly and maliciously initiate a false emergency services call to 911. In this call, Ms. Price made false and defamatory statements regarding the property owner, Ms. Genevieve Price, accusing her of aggressive behavior and trespassing. This action resulted in an unnecessary and potentially dangerous police intervention. This act constitutes a severe breach of the tenancy agreement, specifically defined as tenant harassment of the property owner. The notice did not mention the family argument. It did not mention Leo's homework or Danielle's feelings of being undermined. It stripped the incident of all its emotional context and reduced it to a single, stark, and legally actionable event. A tenant had harassed a landlord. And then came the final section, the ultimatum itself, laid out in clear, numbered points that left no room for misinterpretation. 1. The tenant, Danielle Price, has created a hostile and untenable environment for the property owner. Therefore, to cure this violation, the source of the harassment must be removed. Danielle Price must permanently vacate the property located at 1245 Kenilworth Drive within 30 calendar days of the receipt of this notice. 2. Upon confirmation that Danielle Price has vacated the premises, the tenancy agreement will be formally redrawn in the name of the remaining occupant, Marcus Price, at the same monthly rate. This will allow Marcus Price and his minor child, Leo Price, to continue their residency. 3. Should Danielle Price fail to vacate the premises within the specified 30-day period, the violation will be considered uncured. In this event, the occupants will be required to quit the premises. Formal eviction proceedings will be initiated by the Queen City Property Group, LLC, against all current occupants on the 31st day. It was perfect. It was a legal and strategic masterpiece. It did not just punish Danielle. It forced Marcus to be the agent of that punishment. Protected my grandson. And it framed the entire conflict not as a messy family drama, but as a simple, straightforward business transaction. When Lorraine printed out the final package, the heavy paper crisp and official, I felt a sense of profound and slightly terrifying power. This was the consequence. This was the reckoning. And it was about to be delivered by a man in a uniform with a summons and a smile. The day the notice was served was a Wednesday. I knew the exact time it was happening. Lorraine, with her flair for the dramatic, had hired the best process server in Charlotte. A tall, imposing man with an impassive face and a reputation for unshakable calm. He was instructed to deliver the package at 6 p.m., a time when he was certain both Marcus and Danielle would be home. I spent that afternoon in my garden, my hands deep in the rich, dark soil, trying to ground myself. I was not nervous. I was not gleeful. I was in a state of profound and solemn suspense. I was a general on a distant hill, watching my artillery fire, knowing that the landscape of my family's life was about to be permanently altered. The scene, as Lorraine later had it described to her by the process server, was exactly as we had envisioned. The server, dressed in a neat, official-looking suit, rang the doorbell of the Grand Ballantine house. Danielle answered, a glass of wine in her hand, a look of annoyance on her face at being disturbed during her dinner preparations. Yes, she had asked, her tone clipped. I have a legal delivery for Ms. Danielle Price and Mr. Marcus Price, the server said, his voice a flat, professional monotone. He held out the thick, official-looking envelope. Danielle's look of annoyance shifted to one of confusion and mild alarm. She took the envelope. What is this? I am not at liberty to discuss the contents, ma'am, the server replied. I am only required to confirm that you have received it. Have a good evening. And with that he turned and walked back to his car, his job complete. Danielle, her curiosity now a burning fire, took the envelope into the kitchen where Marcus was helping Leo with his homework at the large granite island. Some guy just dropped this off, she said, tearing it open. It looks like legal papers. Did you forget to pay a bill or something, Marcus? She added, a familiar accusatory edge to her voice. She pulled out the contents. The first thing she saw was the cover letter on the official letterhead of the Queen City Property Group, LLC. She frowned. Queen City Property Group? Who the hell is that? She continued to read, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. Marcus, sensing the change in her demeanor, came to look over her shoulder. Together they looked at the second document, the certified copy of the deed to their house. And they saw the name of the owner. It must have been a moment of pure cognitive dissonance. The name of a company they had never heard of was listed as the owner of the very ground beneath their feet. And then they turned to the third document, the Articles of Incorporation for the LLC. And they saw my name, Genevieve A. Price, sole proprietor. The process server had said he could hear a sharp, strangled gasp from outside the house. It must have been Danielle. In that single stunning moment, her entire world had been turned upside axle. The house she had lorded over, the symbol of her status, the foundation of her identity, was not hers. It was mine. The power dynamic of her entire life, her entire marriage, had been obliterated in the space of a single sentence on a legal form. She was not the queen in her castle. She was a tenant. And her landlady was the woman she had, just days before, had the police escort from the premises. Marcus, she would have seen, was just as shocked, but his shock would have been of a different flavor. It would have been the dawning, horrified understanding of the depth of his mother's long-term planning, and the magnitude of his wife's catastrophic miscalculation. And then, together, they read the final document. The notice to cure or quit. They read the clinical, damning description of Danielle's 911 call, framed not as a moment of pique, but as a legal violation. They read the ultimatum. Here. The choice. Danielle must leave. Or they all would. The power she had wielded so cruelly had been revealed as a complete illusion. The very house she had used as a weapon to humiliate me had just been turned into the instrument of her own potential exile. The notice had been served. The 30-day clock had started ticking. And the Queen of Kenilworth Drive had just been handed her own eviction notice. The legal notice was not a bomb that exploded in the center of their lives. It was a slow-acting, deeply corrosive poison that began to eat away at the foundations of their marriage from the inside out. The document, with its cold, formal language and its irrefutable proof of my ownership, had stripped Danielle of her primary source of power, the house itself. It was no longer her house. It was my property. And she was no longer the queen of the castle. She was a tenant in breach of her lease. The ultimatum was the masterstroke, the part of Lorraine's plan that I admired the most for its surgical precision. It was not a blanket punishment. It did not target my son or my grandson. It targeted only the source of the problem, Danielle. It presented a clear, binary choice, a path to resolution that was entirely dependent on her actions. The notice laid it out in language that was impossible to misinterpret. You, the occupants, are in violation of your tenancy agreement due to the actions of one occupant, Danielle Price. You have 30 calendar days to cure this violation. The cure is defined as the permanent and complete vacating of the premises by Danielle Price. If the cure is successfully implemented within the 30-day period, the tenancy agreement will be considered restored. A new lease will be drafted and executed in the name of the remaining adult occupant, Marcus Price, allowing him and his minor child, Leo Price, to continue their residency under the existing financial terms. If the cure is not implemented within the 30-day period, all occupants will be required to quit the premises. Formal eviction proceedings will be initiated on the 31st day. The genius of the document was that it reframed the entire conflict. This was no longer a messy family dispute about respect or hurt feelings. It was a legal matter, a contractual obligation. And it placed the burden of the solution squarely on Marcus's shoulders. He was no longer a passive bystander, a weary peacemaker caught between two warring women. He was now the primary decision-maker, the man who had to choose between his wife and his home, between his marriage and his son's stability. Danielle, I am sure, did not see it this way. Her first reaction would have been one of pure, sputtering rage. She would have seen it as a declaration of war from me, a vindictive, hateful act. She would have tried to rally Marcus to her side, to frame me as the villain, the cruel, manipulative mother-in-law trying to destroy their lives. She can't do this. I can hear her screaming. This is our home. We'll fight her. We'll get a lawyer. We'll tell everyone what a monster she is. But her weapons were gone. How could she fight? The legal ground beneath her had vanished. The deed was in my name. The LC was mine. They were legally tenants. And she, the tenant, had verifiably harassed the landlord. There was no case. Any lawyer she consulted would tell her the same thing. And how could she wage a public relations war? What would she say? My mother-in-law, who secretly bought us a luxury house and let us live in it for a fraction of its cost for 5 years, is now asking me to leave after I falsely reported her to the police as an aggressive trespasser in that very house. The narrative was not on her side. Her only remaining weapon was her influence over my son. And that, too, had been fatally weakened. Marcus was now armed with the truth from Leo, and with the profound, gut-wrenching shame of his own complicity. The ultimatum did not force him to choose between me and her. It forced him to choose between the past and the future. The past was a continuation of his life of quiet desperation, of constantly placating a toxic, disrespectful wife. The future was a chance to build a peaceful, stable home for his son, free from the constant turmoil and disrespect that Danielle created. The ultimatum was not just a legal document. It was a moral test for my son. It was a final exam. For 30 days he would be forced to live with the consequences of his wife's actions and decide what kind of man he truly wanted to be. The choice was his: cure the problem or be evicted by it. The 30 days that followed were, as Marcus later described them to me, a month-long descent into a special kind of hell. The beautiful, spacious house in Ballantine became a pressure cooker, the air thick with unspoken ultimatums and the ticking of a legal clock. Danielle, stripped of her legal power, deployed her entire arsenal of emotional and psychological warfare. She cycled through every tactic in her manipulative playbook. First came the rage. She screamed. She threw things. She accused Marcus of being a spineless mama's boy, of betraying her, of siding with the crazy old woman who was trying to ruin their lives. She called me every name imaginable, her voice echoing through the large, empty rooms of the house that was no longer hers to command. Marcus, for the first time, did not try to placate her. He just stood there and let the storm break against him, his silence a new and unfamiliar wall she could not breach. When rage failed, she turned to tears. She became the victim. She would cry for hours, sobbing about how she had been humiliated, how her life was being destroyed, how she couldn't believe the man who was supposed to love and protect her was letting his mother do this to her. She would appeal to their history, to their love, to the family they had built. "Are you really going to throw me out on the street, Marcus?" she would wail. "Are you going to make your own wife homeless?" He would respond, his voice quiet but firm, "You are not being thrown out, Danielle. You are being asked to leave a house that does not belong to you, as a direct consequence of your own actions. This is not about my mother. This is about what you did." When tears failed, she tried seduction and promises. She would be sweet, affectionate, the loving wife he had first fallen in love with. She would promise to change. She would apologize for her moment of anger. She would suggest they go to therapy, that they could work through this. "We can fight her together, baby," she would whisper. "Don't let her win. Don't let her break us apart." But Marcus, his eyes now fully open, saw the performance for what it was. It was a tactic, not a transformation. He knew that any change would be temporary, lasting only until the threat was removed. The final week was a campaign of cold, silent warfare. She gave him the silent treatment, hoping to wear him down, to make the atmosphere in the house so unbearable that he would capitulate just for a moment's peace. She would pointedly pack a single box, leaving it in the middle of the living room as a constant, guilt-inducing monument to his betrayal. Throughout it all, Marcus held firm. His resolve was bolstered by two things. The first was the quiet, unwavering support of his son. Leo, who understood the stakes with a child's simple clarity, would give his father small nods of encouragement, a quick hug, a whispered, "You're doing the right thing, Dad." He was Marcus's moral compass. The second was a single brief phone call he had with me in the middle of that month. He had called, his voice strained, and said, "This is the hardest thing I've ever done." I had replied, my own voice gentle but unyielding, "I know it is, son. But you are not just choosing a house. You are choosing a life. You are choosing what you are willing to accept for yourself and what you are willing to model for your son. I will support whatever decision you make. But you have to be the one to make it." The climax came on the 29th day. It was a Friday evening. The deadline was noon the next day. Danielle, her face pale and drawn, made her final stand in the large open-plan kitchen. "So this is it?" she asked, her voice a low, trembling mixture of disbelief and fury. "You're really going to do it? You're going to kick me out?" Marcus stood across the granite island from her, his expression weary but resolute. "I'm not kicking you out, Danielle," he said. "I am asking you to honor the terms of the notice. I am choosing to stay in this house with my son. The terms for that are clear. And you are the one who created those terms." "Because of one stupid mistake," she shrieked. "It was not a mistake," he said, and his voice was colder than she had ever heard it. "It was a choice. You chose to call the police on my mother. You chose to lie. You chose to humiliate a woman who has done nothing but help us. And now I am making a choice. I am choosing peace. I am choosing respect. I am choosing a home where my son doesn't have to watch his grandmother be treated like trash. And if the price of that home is you not being in it, then yes. That is the price I am willing to pay." The finality in his voice was absolute. She stared at him, and in that moment she finally understood. She had lost. Her power, her influence, her control over him, it was all gone. She let out a single, ugly, mirthless laugh. "Fine," she spat. "Fine. You want this house so bad. You can have it. You and your sainted mother. I hope you're very happy in it." She turned, walked up the stairs, and began to pack her bags in earnest. The choice had been made. The ultimatum had been met. The cure had been implemented. And the queen, at long last, was being exiled from the castle. The day after Danielle left was a Saturday. The silence in the big Ballantine house was not empty. It was peaceful. The oppressive weight of her personality, the constant, simmering tension she created, was gone. It was as if the house itself could finally breathe a sigh of relief. I drove over that afternoon. I didn't call first. I just came. When Marcus opened the door, he looked tired, but he also looked lighter, as if a great burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He gave me a hug, a real one, the kind he hadn't given me in years. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice quiet. "Come on in." I stepped inside. The house felt different. Felt like a home again. Leo came running from the living room and threw his arms around my waist, burying his face in my side. "You're back, Grandma," he said, his voice muffled. "I'm back, baby," I said, stroking his hair, my heart full. We didn't talk about Danielle at first. We just existed in the new, quiet peace. I helped Marcus and Leo make lunch. We sat at the kitchen island, the three of us, and we talked. We talked about Leo's school, about a new project Marcus was working on, about the book I was reading. It was normal. It was easy. It was the kind of simple, loving family interaction I had been craving for years. Later, while Leo was in the backyard, finally playing with the drone his other grandparents had given him, Marcus and I sat on the back patio. "She's staying with her parents for now," he said, finally broaching the subject. "She's not happy." "I didn't expect she would be," I said. He looked at me, his eyes full of a new, hard-won wisdom. "I am so sorry, Mom. For everything. For how long it took me to see. I was so afraid of the fighting, of the conflict, that I let it happen. I let you pay the price for my peace." "We all make mistakes, Marcus," I said. "The important thing is what we do after we realize we've made them." I know what I have to do now, he said. I have to be a better father to Leo. I have to teach him what real strength and respect look like. And I can't do that in a house full of anger. He was right. He had finally truly understood. The following week, Lorraine drew up the new lease. It was a formal legal document between the Queen City Property Group, LLC, and Marcus Price. It laid out the terms of his residency, the same modest monthly payment he had always made. He signed it in Lorraine's office, a quiet, solemn act that solidified his new reality. He was no longer living a lie. He was a tenant, but he was a tenant in a peaceful, stable home that he could now truly make his own. I have not transferred the deed to him. Not yet. He needs to stand on his own 2 feet for a while, to prove that the change in him is real and lasting. But one day perhaps the house will be his in truth and in name. For now I have reclaimed what was mine. Not just the property but my dignity, my peace of mind, and my relationship with my son and grandson. The revenge was not in the eviction. The revenge was in the restoration. I had surgically removed the source of the poison, and in doing so I had saved the patient. I had lost a daughter-in-law, but I had gotten my family back. And as I sat on the patio of my house watching my grandson fly his drone in the golden afternoon light, I knew with a deep and profound certainty that it was the best deal I had ever made.